to start looking at this list that we have been talking about the last couple of weeks. Jesus gives us this list of all the events that will signal the beginning of the end time. Now, remember all the disclaimers we talked about last week. Nobody knows when it's actually going to happen. These are the beginnings. There's a lot of stuff that we went over in some depth last week. Now, we will look at this list one at a time over the next probably 3 months, maybe, or longer, I don't know. We will consider a lot of other biblical passages that are applicable, that make sense. Now, I do want you to know we're not going to study them in strict order, and you'll see that today. We're going to combine things that make sense together. So, we're going to look at 3 of the 19 items today in this class. We got through them on Thursday, so it shouldn't be an issue. All right, and remember, I will remind you this of every lesson we start. We're just blind people checking out an elephant. So, as such, we might not actually have right answers. Remember, our blind guys, they all knew what the elephant looked like, but none of them really knew what the elephant looked like. So, item number 1 on Jesus' list is the destruction of the temple. And actually, technically, when he was asked, when are these things going to happen, what's going to the signs, he didn't go back to this, but it really is part of the list, and it's important to see here in a second. So what is the context of this whole thing? Remember, Jesus and his disciples have been at the temple. It's the last week of Jesus' life. They've been in the temple. They leave the temple area. They go out, and they're sitting on the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives was very adjacent to the temple. It was in that same neck of the woods. Okay? You could literally look across the valley and see the temple from where they were standing on the Mount of Olives. So, as they're standing there, the disciples, remember they just come out of the temple, said, hey, look at how beautiful this place is. Okay? They said, what an incredible building. And it truly was. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But when they made that comment, this was Jesus' response. This is the way Matthew records it. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. And Mark has almost the exact same words. Okay? Luke records it just a little bit differently. As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Luke has that little expression, the time will come, clearly sometime in the future, which it was, obviously. Okay? So they all have very similar words. And this was the essence. Everything you see here will be torn down. Right? Again, Luke has that little disclaimer. Okay. This prophecy was fulfilled about 40 years later in 70 AD when the Romans besieged Jerusalem to put down the revolt. Right? The Jews had enough of the Roman rule. They didn't like the Romans from the beginning. They'd been there for 100 years, give or take a little. And the Jews said, we're done. We're going to revolt. Well, unfortunately, the Romans were much more equipped militarily than the Jews were, and so they crushed the revolt very easily. Okay? Now, we talked about this Thursday. Whenever you conquer a foreign power, one of the first 2 things you want to dismantle. Well, I would make it broader, but you're right. Okay. Okay. The 2 things you want to get rid of are the government, which would include the army. What? Oh. Okay? country is you want to get rid of the government, the military, and you want to overthrow the religious structure. Those are absolutely correct. When you do that, you take all the power out of a country. I mean, remember a few years ago when they tried to 9/11, we were all famous? They were aiming at the government. That one missed, okay, because we took down the plane. They also worked on the finances. Now, finances weren't nearly as big an issue in the first century as they are now, but there, they attacked the World Trade Center, which was the symbol of the financial system in the United States. Okay? Let's pray for Leslie before we Father, just put your hand upon Leslie. With her. Very tough moment. Just your hand upon her. Strength. So, that's what they do. They wiped out the temple, which was the symbol of Jewish religion. The temple was truly the most sacred spot in Israel, without doubt. And they tore it down. Remember, Jesus got in trouble because he said, tear down this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. He was talking about his body and the resurrection, but the literal temple was very important. Now, this was known as Herod's temple. And I'm going to give you a little history of the temple here so you know, okay? But first, this is the only item of the 19 mentioned in the discourse that has been completely fulfilled. We talked a little bit last week. Several others have been partially fulfilled. Earthquakes and famines and rumors of war. Those have been being fulfilled ongoing for centuries. But this one has been completely fulfilled. Jesus said the temple's going to be destroyed. It was, just 40 years later. In fact, some of the guys who were sitting there listening to him were there and witnessed it. They were still alive. All right, so let's look at the history of the temple. The original temple, which was known as Solomon's temple, was built approximately 1326. That's when it was completed. It took about 40 years to build. A huge project. It was destroyed in 856 by Babylonian forces led by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the temple that Solomon built was an incredible structure. Okay? The Bible says that the stones were quarried hundreds of miles away, shipped across land, or floated on barges, some of them, and that there were no tools used at the construction site. They all just slid together perfectly. We think we have engineers nowadays, we have nothing. Okay? They built that building without tools at the site. Okay? But it stood there for, as you can see, well over 500 years. Okay? It was an incredibly magnificent building. Look, in today's value, millions and millions of dollars worth of gold and precious metals. Okay? But it had been built by Solomon. Okay. 70 years later, it was rebuilt when King Darius sent people back to Jerusalem and to Israel from the exiles. They rebuilt the temple. The political guy was named Zerubbabel. Okay, not important. But he was the political leader. He was the guy appointed by the king by King Darius to lead the people politically. Jeremiah actually prophesied this. Jeremiah 29:11, which is the verse just before 29:11, where we know I've done the plans for you, plans to prosper you. That's in this chapter. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When 70 years are completed from Babylon, I will come to you, fulfill my good promise, and bring you back to this place. Okay? So 70 years, that's what God said would happen. Jeremiah prophesied it, and it did. King Darius sent people back to Israel. You can find the story of the rebuilding of the temple in the books of Ezra and Haggai in the Old Testament. Okay? Nehemiah was the key guy on the religious side of the process. Remember, Nehemiah went back and helped them rebuild the walls so they would be safe. The first thing he said after they got the walls done was, we got to rebuild the temple. The walls are up, we're safe, we got to rebuild the temple. Okay? Now, we know Darius, from the Bible record, Darius sent permission and materials to do that, and it was rebuilt. Now, if you study the Old Testament, it was not nearly the structure that it had been under Solomon. Okay? In fact, there's a verse in the Bible that says, you remember they had their place of worship at. Now, King Herod the Great, who was one of the only good Herods, there were lots of King Herods in Israel's history. One at the time of Christ was a tyrannical dictator who tried to murder children. We all know that story. But this was, I think, his great-grandfather, maybe great-great-grandfather, back a few generations. Made significant improvements and renovations to the Second Temple around 16 BC, about 16, 18 years before Christ was born. And that's why it was called Herod's Temple, okay? Because he had refurbished it, if you will. And literally, when Herod redid the temple, it was actually bigger than when Solomon built it originally. If you study the history, it was bigger than Solomon's original structure. Now, probably not quite as ornate and incredible in terms of all the gold and stuff, but it was actually bigger than what Solomon had produced. So, this second temple was the one that Jesus and his disciples were looking at when they asked the question about the Olivet discourse. They were literally looking at that building that had been there for 500 plus years, had been renovated just before most of them were born, or maybe about the time some of them were born. And that's what Jesus was looking at when he gave this speech. So that's just a little background. This is important. The destruction of the temple put an end to the daily sacrifices that Israel had been offering literally since the time of Moses. Remember, in the Old Testament law, Moses instituted the sacrificial system. Now, there were a few periods in time where it got lapsed, bad kings, shut it down. But in general, the offering of the morning and evening sacrifices had been going on since Moses. The tabernacle in the wilderness that Moses built, then David had the tent erected and the ark brought in, then Solomon built the temple, then it was destroyed and rebuilt. So there were some gaps in this time. But basically the daily offerings had been made for thousands of years. And when the Romans sacked the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, that ended the sacrificial system, which has never been restored. It does not exist to this day. Okay. Basically what we have now is known as rabbinic Judaism. Okay? Which is much more influenced by the rabbinical teachings, the rabbis, than by the teachings of Moses, unfortunately. But that's a really important piece, because the offering of the sacrifice is a big part of the end time stuff. So we'll get to that here in a second. But remember that since 70 AD, no regular sacrifices have been made. So well over 2,000 years. We're right at 2,000 years. All right. It is noteworthy that Daniel was among the exiles taken when Solomon's temple was destroyed in 586. Daniel is probably the most significant prophetic voice of the Old Testament when it comes to end time stuff. So he was actually in that group of people that were taken to Babylon for that 70 years. Now, interestingly, we don't know whether Daniel ever went back to Jerusalem or not. The Bible does not tell us. He would have been a very, very old man by that time. Okay? We know he was a young man, that's what he's called when Daniel begins, probably late teens. Maybe in his early 20s, we don't know for sure, along with Shadrach,